Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the Podcast, the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by co-host Terry Robinson. And have you ever wondered what Infernalists get up to in the middle of the night? Yeah, I didn't either, but we're going to talk about it today on Tomes of Magick because that's the next book. But before we dive headfirst into depravity, Terry, are there any announcements?
Yeah, I am pleased to announce that Mage the Podcast is forming a little company because we have officially passed a little threshold on Patreon where they say, hey, you need to file tax documentation. And I'm like, we've made it! The IRS cares about us. Now, mind you, lemonade stands make enough money in most cases to pass that hurdle, but still, that puts us in league with some of the best lemonade stands in America, and I would like to thank our executive producers for getting us there. So, yeah, if you hear stories about whatever happened to Mage the Podcast, they went down for embezzlement, know that it started now. So, that's all I got announcement-wise.
No, we really do appreciate our executive producers. Mm-hmm. They make a lot of this possible. I had a microphone problem. We were wondering, okay, now what? But we were able to get another microphone. We got right back to recording. We really appreciate things like that.
Some of our recurring guests, we have just sent them equipment because it's like, you've been on 6 or 7 times and you'll probably be on a couple times before. We're sending you a mic stand. And that's a nice place to be.
Yeah, definitely. Well, today on Tomes of Magick, we are looking at Infernalism, The Path of Screams. I feel like I should sort of scream to go along with that, but I'm just going to demur on this case. This book was put out in 1998. The author is Sotiros Brocato, who back at that time was publishing under the name Phil Brocato. Clocks in at 127 pages. A lot of people get the impression, oh, this is the Nefandi book. It's like, well, actually, as we learned in the core book for Sorcerer's Crusade, the Nefandi were one of the bad groups at that time, but there were other bad groups. They had not yet really come under one umbrella. And so this book helps us to understand that distinction, looks at some of the different groups, and even talks about how there's some activity where the modern Nefandi that we know is already starting to be built. Before I get into too much detail, Terry, can you give us a walkthrough?
I would be glad to. I came up with 3 alternative titles. This is a intermittent Mage the Podcast segment. And the 3 I had were, the first one was Oops, All Baby Eaters, which is a reference to the meme of like Oops, All Marshmallows variant for cereals. The second one was What if the people in the age where people were more terrible were more terrible? And my final alternative title was Book of the Fallen. We'll get into that in some detail. But I noticed that I think this is the first Mage book that is a art house imprint, which is the White Wolf's imprint that was to cover the things that probably wouldn't pay for themselves. So needless to say, it was Sorcerer's Crusade and Changeling.
Yeah, I did notice the art house on the back. It said suggested for mature readers, but hey, I read it anyways.
Yeah. It is also interesting in that this book is listed as copyrighted 1998, and the promo in the back is listed as March 2000. So I'm kind of curious if they weren't sure when things were going out or they were selective in what they were being promoting or something else, but that was just a thing that I was kind of curious about. We have a special note that says, Black magic is not cool, merely stupid. Do not worship Satan. Do not kill anyone or anything. Do not kill yourself. Mage is a game. Have fun. Thank you. Sleep tight. Which reminds me of Jesse Heinig's line from Revised that says, I need to tell you not to do this. I know most of you are not idiots, but even if a small fraction are idiots, there's a lot of you. So there's probably some dumb people out there. Also, dumb people ruin things for everyone else. And that is probably my favorite reminder, and I wish that had been like the boilerplate that was used throughout all the books. The opening is Prelude to Damnation. And it is a trapped infernalist awaiting the opportunity to confess. And he's like, you probably want me to tell you all of my dark secrets. Well, I'm not. Except for the part where I'm really proud of my dark secrets, and I will tell you my dark secrets. And you're like, oh, that took a turn. And then there was this recurring line of, the descriptor I wrote to myself was, Emo Kin Wizard talks about how dark he really is, but it's actually your fault but for him doing this, but you're the real sheep. and it goes over how he had no choice but to fall into damnation, but also he's the only one with freedom, so take that. So I'm like, oh wow, this is actually very advanced, because this is 300 years before emo kid reads Nietzsche to come along. But it's a fine prelude, makes vague references to very bad things, and then the section is bookended on each side by the cover art by, I think, Christopher Shy, and then the opening chapter introduction work by Christopher Shy, which is like kind of peak Christopher Shy, because it's like, what if things were beige and poorly focused and vaguely androgynous and everyone looked mildly distracted? And that's kind of the recurring art motif. Did you have any thoughts about the prelude, Adam?
Yeah, the prelude was a bit much for me. It's really awful guy saying, I'm not going to tell you my secrets, but I will tell you everything I've been doing for the past few years.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I was good at don't tell me your secrets.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, you want to know what I did to my wife? No, I don't. But
No,
yeah,
good.
okay, you're going to tell me.
I'm...
You know where I get the leather from my books? No, I don't want to know. Okay, you're going to tell me. I suppose a little interesting, but yeah, I'm ready for the intro.
The introduction indicates that demon worshipping has gone by many names. Immediately, I could see the precursors of the Book of the Fallen, that some people choose to become a lesser fallen angel, that in their fall they face freedom, and also the note that the fall is liberating and wonderful. And there's a note that basically says, too bad the fall can't last forever. I'm like, that's kind of interesting. We get a long list of terms. We get a page and a half lexicon. We also get an additional thing that indicates a note from the author that says, hey, this isn't going to be a book on the Nefandi, but I had to write this because people demanded that I write this. And I'm like, I wasn't really playing Mage in 98. I don't know if people were demanding this. It talks about how the audience needs villains. The face of evil demands more than a simple boogeyman mask. And then the question now becomes, will the rest of the book deliver on that? Will it deliver an evil that is beyond mere boogied men? Of the words that were listed, some of the ones that stuck out to me were the term adversary is brought up and is mapped onto the idea of Satan, rather than like a concept of opposition. The idea of the barriers that need to be overcome is not kind of the concept of the adversary, which I am used to whenever just the term adversary is listed. We get the term Aesfotedia, which is infernal tasks, and we get supplicium, which is the Nephandic term, or the infernalist, or the diabolical term for seeking. But it goes hard quickly in terms of giving us terms for things. We get the Claw, the wild subhumans who worship the void, which will be related to the Kalashah, and then immediately above that it says the Kalashah, the Nefandi who worship the void. And you're like, do we need both of these? But still, I'm a sucker for a good lexicon. Adam, what did you think?
When I was reading through the lexicon, I felt like Nefandi terms kind of dominated it, and that seemed a bit odd to me. I thought they were a smaller, less influential group at that time. But getting back to your comment about in 1998, I was playing Mage since the beginning, and I was active online in 98, and I talked with other Mage fans, but I don't remember anyone saying, oh, I really want to hear more about the Nefandi, or oh, I want, I just got to get into detail on this group. I talked to some people who used them as NPC villains, but I don't remember anyone saying, I need this or I want this. It was mostly a lot of people talking about how they wanted more on the technocracy or more on the traditions. So I don't know, maybe there was some other group that really wanted this in 98.
That was another interesting thing, because the cover of the book says by Phil Bricado, and books almost never have by on them. Except for certain fiction books. So it was weird to see it there, because there is no other book in Sorcerer's Crusade that has by and then an author on it. But then again, most of them don't have a sole author. Chapter 1, Better to Reign in Hell. The universe started in darkness, it split and wished to know itself. The shards of light and darkness fought, and the shards of shadow waited, because apparently shadow is neither light nor dark, even though shadow almost by definition is dark. I'm not going to dwell on that. This cut the universe into a sequence of opposites. The war moved to Earth as emanations tried to dominate over each other. You had darkness, which embraced oblivion. You had the shards of light, which embraced fire. The shadows eventually became the elements of shaping passion, inquiry, and mystery. And from these four elements, man was born. Humanity was born. Emanations wove illusions to entrap humans or tried to seduce them, and most were destroyed. When human steps first occurred, they rent the spirit world, and humanity remained free from the direct influence of the shards. But all of humans had a shard of the void trapped within their soul that called to them and drew them in, which would suggest that they did not, in fact, remain free from the call of the void. Some called out to the darkness, and it answered. Civilization saved the weak, which should have been cold. So we get the idea that among some mages, some infernalists, and specifically the Nefandi seemingly, they think that the contrivance of civilization is a bad thing, in that it has allowed the weak to continue to breed. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is great. We got eugenics vibes going from chapter 1. To reach its ultimate potential, humanity needs to cull the weak. A first city rose, and the eaters of the weak walked and summoned their dark lords. Those who faltered were consumed. And that suggests that infernalism is kind of the antidote to civilization, which is interesting because, like, to me, that's what the verbena are, and not in the baby-eating way. The prophets came of various religions and changed things. Eventually, they also have this idea that there is this background thing where the Abrahamic God did not start out as all-powerful and slowly became more and more powerful, consuming pagan gods and so on as worship spread. That there are several stories of Lucifer as the true lover of humanity and was a would-be conqueror and rebel, and we get a bunch of different versions of the fall of Lucifer, the Morning Star, first rebellion or whatever. We get a bunch of variants of the garden where humanity was first alive, that Lucifer kept at it in terms of trying to tend to the garden because he knew that there was void in man's heart and it must be either tended or snuffed out, depending on which interpretation you like. Each prophet took from the power of the old gods. They became angels and fled. That you as a person are chained to eternity, bound to light or darkness, and those outside the book of this all-powerful Abrahamic God were eventually cast out. I like the idea that it mentions that each time there was a new prophet of some sort, that it shook hell and broke spells, that infernalists died every time, like Buddha or Christ or Muhammad came into the world. And it says, it has this particular aside that said, this is a mix of a whole bunch of different religions, which is fine. But sometimes these combinations are a little bit clumsy. The book does try and give you a couple of different options and interpretations. It does the thing where it uses the phrase, some people say, probably 230 million times. And I wish it would kind of put some names behind that and be like, this faction thinks this faction thinks this. That way you could just kind of have that, but close enough. It mentions the idea that the Abrahamic God created the great chain of being to bind chaos, that the tyranny of God was required, otherwise primordial chaos would slip through and destroy creation, while in the wastes of Arabia, the devil kings ruled and the jinn and dark spirits walked amongst the streets. The Batini worked to counter them, but the region was prosperous. And it says that like it was a bad thing, where it was like this area was so overrun with devils and so on that commerce happened openly and freely. And you're like, oh yeah, that does sound... Wait, no, that sounds pretty good. Let's, maybe they're onto something. That during this era, the religious violence between sects pleased the adversary. It then also does the thing where it said that millions of people were burned during the witch burnings. My interpretation of this is maybe in the world of darkness, but not in actual human history, where the figure was probably in the 5 to low 6 figures. Again, that's a lot of people to die for a thing, and we don't want that to have happened, but it's not quite in the millions category. We then get a section on the interface between infernalism and the various faiths of the world that are active at the time. We get the idea that Jewish mages view the adversary as the great tester of creation, and this is done with God's blessing, that Solomonic rituals pull on dark angels that simply appear to be demons. Hell is not so much a place of torture as much as an area merely outside of God's light. That we get, this is the first explanation we have of the Qliphoth, the regions containing the chaotic essences of the 10 branches of creation that infernalists try and harness, that either represent areas cut off from humans' understanding or that were previous attempts at creation, or darknesses that God had banished. The Gnostics believe that the Old Testament God is a bad God, that Gnostic branches of belief are actively being purged, and sometimes they become fronts for infernalism. In Orthodox belief, Lucifer is the great fallen angel, the firstborn among the hosts that rebelled against the Most High, and was banished first to earth, then to hell. Lucifer spends 1,000 years on the surface and will then be banished back to hell, and forms kind of a dark trinity, with Lucifer being the Father, Satan the Son, and the unholy Spirit being the dragon. Adam, did you like that section we got describing the dragon? Because I did. Oh, wait, there wasn't one. At least that I noticed.
No, there wasn't.
Yeah. It mentions Luciferians consider Lucifer to be a victim of circumstances, which I love the idea of Lucifer being like, I'm a victim of circumstances. That God is the real tyrant and that hell is Lucifer's prison. All have a tie to it due to the original sin, and we will return there unless you find Jesus. This section, as I read through it, does really sound like a mishmash of ideas. It is a mishmash of ideas, but it's a somewhat interesting mishmash of ideas. This is also one of those things where, as someone who has done a fair amount of reading on the Gnostics, I'm like, this is kind of just jamming stuff in there. And then I remember the state of Gnostic scholarship in 1998 was not the most developed thing on the face of the planet, so there were a lot of people doing things in their own little corner that hadn't really talked to each other. So you're like, oh, this is jamming together like Dickean Gnosticism with Valentinian and Platonian. Within Islam, Satan is a servant also of the Most High, that God created Adam and Adam demanded that all creation bow to him, but Satan refused, saying that was idolatry, and he waits for the time for him to be called upon again. Islamic hell is a place of blasted waste where pity and hope die, and demons are creatures of that waste. In Eastern religion, Satan fulfills part of God's role, being a necessary evil, quite literally. The conflation of destruction with evil is unreasonable in these views. Eastern religions do not view the world in any way as humane, and various aspects, for instance, of Kali are not to be ignored. At some point, the good divine order will be overthrown, and a new order will emerge, and hell in these regions tends to be a temporary area where one is cleansed. Mind you, this is temporary on a cosmic scale, so you may be in the hell of constantly stepping on Legos for a billion years or something like that, but compared to infinity, that's just kind of a blink of the eye. The last section it goes over are the view of God in the old faiths, where almost every god was in some way brutal. Every deity could be cruel. Infernalists simply choose a patron that matches their preferences. Everything is natural in their view, in that there is no truly supernatural thing. All heavens and hells are just distant parts of this reality, which I like because it kind of explains some of the pagan magical views, where it's like, of course you can walk to the Umbra, there's nothing else, some things are just harder to get to. Their hells are areas of dust and ash where ghosts mourn their lives. Again, most of these hells are temporary before someone returns. Generally the gods enjoy sacrifice. Many of the infernalists that are tied to pagan beliefs believe that they are their god's effort to cry out for revenge. And with that, the chapter ends. This chapter covers a lot of epistemological territory, so if it sounded like I was running through it, I was. I had 17 notes from the first page alone on the, let's say, the Fable of the Shards, Foundation of Humanity. So if you want a weird alternative cosmogony for a character to have, I think this chapter's pretty good in that regard. It gets a little bit messy. It has some details in areas where I didn't need details and lacks details in areas where I did, but that's always going to be a question of personal taste. But all in all, it kind of keeps moving. But what did you think about chapter 1, Adam?
Page 18, War in Heaven. This was like a direct inverting of the Pure Ones talk from earlier mage books. So I guess it was kind of fun and kind of appropriate to see it, but then on the other hand, it seemed like, such a 100% inverting. It's like, couldn't we have done a little more with this? I thought the ancient city of Bot was an interesting part of Shadow history. I'll always like to see stuff like that in World of Darkness games. With so many possible Infernalist origin stories, because there are so many different Infernalist groups at this point in the Mage timeline, it seems strange to focus on one and say, yeah, this is the one. It would have been nice to get, say, 3 or 4 and say, this group thinks this and this group thinks this. It would have been a lot more fun. This chapter really kind of focused on one narrative for some time. There was some more good shadow history in this chapter. I liked the evil cities in the wastes of Arabia. That got my imagination going, and so it was fun to see that kind of stuff. In the 90s, we could still get a good helping of shadow history. What was interesting for me was, if the narrative of this book is accepted, the Jinn were a lot more bad than they get credit for in Mage 20. Mage 20 says, "Hey, we're just misunderstood. We got a raw deal, but and there's good reason why we're so upset, but we're basically decent folks." And you read this like, no, they were not basically decent folks. They were up to some bad stuff, and if they were given more freedom in the modern day, they might get back up to it again. So that was certainly interesting to look over and consider for my own games. There was a lot of this kind of long-winded explanation of the point of view of these Nefandi kind of people. And my point is, we know that the bad guys are bad. We basically, we don't need this much material to tell us exactly what they think. My thinking was, if your players are playing evil characters, this much detail could be useful for them. But if the Infernalists are NPCs, then this level of detail was a lot more than I needed. Page 24, there's a section, Zarathustra, that gets into how Zoroastrianism was a major influence on the other religions. And I was reading this, it's like, why are we sidetracking to comparative religions thesis? It's like, I don't think even mages at this time in history are really going to be talking about this or even noticing this. So it was, and then there's a 4-page section towards the end, Religion and Infernalism, which was going into detail about how the different major religions interact with Infernalism. And I thought there was a lot of oversimplifications in here. There was a lot of heavy interpretations on the author's part. I just didn't find it useful or even terribly interesting. It was a mixed bag for me. There was the good stuff I really liked. The useless stuff, I felt like I was kind of wasting my time. Overall, let's take a look at Chapter 2.
Chapter 2 starts with the reasons to become an Infernalist. It talks about what the things can be. It still kind of insists that all Infernalists have good reasons for being an Infernalist. When we look at human history, though, there are a lot of people that are evil for almost cartoonish reasons. It is frequently the case that you will look at world history and you'll see a figure like Stalin or Pol Pot or something like that, and you're like, this is terribly written. Whoever did this? Oh, wait, this actually happened. This is what evil has looked like throughout human history. It does not hew to these notions that evil needs to be understandable. It goes over that this could be caused by desperation, envy, or greed, a sense of fatalism, that this is a no-win situation, that this is a natural part of rebellion and a way of expressing anger. Some deeds cannot go unpunished, and palling on the power of the infernal is one of those ways of making sure that you have access to the tools to see justice delivered unto the world, that it could be a path of enlightenment to self-rule and self-mastery and power, that it could be done out of laziness as a shortcut to power, that you think that humans are kind of a butt of some sort of cosmic joke, which it refers to as Luciferianism, that it is our divine inheritance that we rule over hell, that it is just an expression of perversity, indulgence, and our own destiny, that it is a yearning for beauty of some sort, that it could be spurned on by love and lust, and ultimately that there is some ultimate quest for the truth that your character is going through that pushes them in this direction. And much like natures and demeanors, many of these are just kind of subtle variants of another, where it's like, you want a thing you can't have, and you think the universe is being a jerk for not giving it to you. And you're like, well, that cut out 3 pages of writing. Good job there, Robinson. It then gives us the Path of Screams, which are the steps one takes to become an Infernalist, which is nearly identical to the ones that are listed in Book of the Fallen. The first step is awareness. You become aware that there is some sort of hunger, a thing or a desire that you want. The initiate learns that there is some sort of font of wisdom and gets angry at their previous state, where it's like, I'm so mad I used to be dumb. They learn about the law of predation in a seminar where they are asked to buy a timeshare at the end or something like that. There is the nightmare dance period where the Infernalist and their avatar kind of fight, but it kind of suggests in a vague, sexy way. And that your avatar proves to be your guide during this dance, which makes the avatar much more active in your dark ascent than it is in any other paradigm. We're like, oh, you're a pagan? Yeah, okay, let me put down my book. I'll help you with the seeking. Oh, you're an Order of Reason member. Okay, we can figure something out. You're like, Infernalism? Be still my heart. Hold on. Let me get on my finest ascension pants. And then your avatar runs away to do costume changes so it can help you through your simplicium, your dark seekings, which now you know what my headcanon is for Nephandic avatars, that they're all theater kids that are just waiting for their mages to fall to temptation so they can do scenery changes. So they learn the law of predation. The initiate initially denies the wisdom or what the avatar is bringing. It says, look inside yourself, you know it's true. And then your character screams screams no, and then you fall from the antenna in Cloud City until you're picked up by the Millennium Falcon. I assume this is all canon. The initiate starts pursuing dark mysteries. This part is painful, and some people snap and become marauders, which is interesting because it also mentions that these people need not be awakened. Those who have endured have literally gone to hell and returned, unless they don't actually believe in a hell. Stage 2 is instruction, where you apparently take a sequence of night courses to get your associate's degree in Satanism before you can move on to the third one, where you get to start selling cosmetics or something like that. The person purges themselves of their previous morality and beliefs. They engage in a period of raw rebellion, as opposed to the more common Pittsburgh rebellion, which is done with a light sear on the outside, or a medium rare rebellion, which is done until it is about as fleshy as the area between your thumb and forefinger. The mage must realize that true power cannot merely be written down, that magic is a reflection of the caster, and that they need to be a deliberate injury unto creation. True magic cannot be written down, which is why we get a long section on the importance of tomes. Many are able to learn on their own, but others call upon a patronus. And I'm sorry, but Harry Potter has just completely destroyed that word for me. And I just picture a Nefandi being like, Wingardium Leviosa. And I'm like, okay, officially cannot take you seriously. They may make their first pact, like my Fisher Price is my first demonic pact, where they have to do something terrible, which is what all these pacts are. It has this recurring theme where it talks about the various weaves of lies. And it's like, the first weave of lies is when they learn that the universe is all about predation, even though it's not, even though it totally is. And then it mentions the second weave and then the fourth wave. I don't know if this is one of those things where you, as a high school prank, release mice labeled 1, 2, 3, and 5 to kind of mess with people, but I don't think there was a third weave of lies. If you know what it is, please tell me. The next stage is the Howl of Freedom and Conflict. The Infernalist becomes a fallen angel on Earth, where they get a sexy leather jacket and a motorcycle, and they ride into the night, which is why the Infernalists weren't nearly as successful, because gasoline refinement hadn't been invented yet, so they couldn't go very far. We get an aside that many Infernalists are tempters, that they will use sex, money, or social position to get what they want, which is tools unique to everyone in the world of darkness, as well as knowledge and raw power. Many will eventually give into their power and lose track of the fact that indulgence is merely a reward for freedom and not necessarily a goal unto itself, except for the groups for which indulgence is a goal unto itself and a source of power. Many get stuck here, and many a do-gooder will bring the world down around them. The truly successful specialize and may appeal to some sort of base desire or some cosmic principle. Others hunger for the void and wish to go to a place beyond regular reality. It may result in a Patronus demanding favors in exchange for its dark miracles. Stage 4 is communication with the absolute and resolution. I think the 5th stage is bargaining, and the 6th stage is resolution. Can't remember if these stages map to the stages of grief or not. Most recognize that something is going to happen to them which is terrible in the form of damnation. And this is the part that always kind of loses me, that many believe he will be rewarded with a great service or be rewarded in exchange for great service by communing with oblivion. Many go screaming into damnation beforehand. Some snarl defiantly and curse their captors, and others extend their lives as long as they can. This kind of cosmically suggests that like hell is real and damnation is real, and then it also has a number of asides where it's like that's only because the people believing in it worship it. But like if your paradigm is that it is a cosmic lie and you are the true heroes, like wouldn't your failure along the path be met as though you are a martyr? Like it really didn't have that option, and it's like this is just the ironic result of believing in damnation. But if you think the path of damnation is how you free humanity, then shouldn't it have a different result than this?
Yeah, to comment on that, I also noticed there was sort of a conflict in my mind reading through this section, because one of the basic ideas about all of the editions of Mage is you were a regular person who thought like the rest of them, but then you awakened to magic and you saw, oh, it's not like I thought it was. It's actually very different. And then here it's saying, yeah, it's just like all the people think it. Mages think just like everyone else, even though their eyes have been open to magic and they see that everything's different than they thought it was. And so, yeah, that sort of conflict there was sort of odd for me. Yeah.
And all of those results kind of result in this upper out thing where the Infernalist is either kicked in the keister or they get to merge with Oblivion and become a minor demon. And you're like, oh, great. You get to start at the bottom of another pyramid scheme. That's super great. We then get templates. And this is the thing in the end, again, because this is still a second edition-ish book, every book needs to include a thing where the reader is told that they are wrong about something. And this is the portion where it's like, you think Satan worshippers all look like this. Well, you're wrong. I'm like, well, I didn't think that, but it's good to know that you've already yelled at me and we are in chapter 2. The templates try and show that infernalists are everywhere, to which M20 says, hold my beer. But this feels like it conflicts with the previous statement that indicates that, like, the path of infernalism is pretty constant in terms of what the steps are. I would have loved a little bit that separated the infernalist from the non-infernalist version of a given archetype. So, like, you have the academic who's like, humans should know everything. And then you have the infernalist that goes, no, humans should know everything. And you're like, oh. Someone's being a little bit extra here. A lot of these are just kind of vampire clans, for lack of a better term. You have the Catacomb Rat, which is just kind of a Nosferatu. You have the Freakmaker, and that's just kind of like the Zamisi. And you have the Art Appreciator, and you're like, okay, Toreador, this is getting the person who just pursues power. I'm like, good thing we've got the Venture covered. And it just kind of kept going. And then it's like, oh crap, we also need dark androids. Oh, they don't have androids in this era. So we'll have it be like, you're evil, but use iron a lot. I'm like, glad we could get the Infernalist iterators in here. The art was lovely, at least. Thank you, Mark Jackson, for having done those pieces. I think some of these were actually genuinely useful for indicating how different ways of life can be a pathway onto the path of screams. The problem to me, though, is it did not do a good job of tying these archetypes to the path that was previously laid out that suggested that everyone's path to the adversary or to the void was consistent. It also has this problem that it later talks about how the Nephandi are unique because they want to merge with the void. But in this section on the path of screams, it indicates that everyone ultimately, every true infernalist wants to kind of do something kind of similar. So it felt like there were kind of two sets of narratives going through the book, and they didn't quite meet. We then get the Great Beast section. We get a period Jodie Blake who joins groups, tries to convert them to infernalism, and if she fails, she reports them as heretics and arrives in her witch hunter alter ego, which I thought was cool. We get the story of the Centipede King, which if you have a phobia about centipedes, this is not a character you want to read on because it is very centipede heavy. Alternatively, if you're very pro centipede, you have your new favorite character. We get the origin of the term Gelidian, but the person seems to in no way do what a Gelidian does. Like, they are not a person that leads like a labyrinth. In fact, it's kind of the opposite, where they're like, yeah, he didn't really ask for a lot and he got it, and everyone kind of talks about him like he's a moron. Anyway, that's our term for someone who leads a labyrinth, who has the power to quash lesser beings. Moving on, and we get more information about Tezgul the Insane, which is to say any. We also get Squid Blargo, the mad pornographer, and that's all I need to say about that. So that brings us to the end of chapter 2. Adam, what did you think about this barrel of laughs of a chapter?
Was a lot of content here. Page 33 had a quote that really grabbed my attention as a storyteller. It says, quote, "The enlightened ones who regularly travel through both heavens and hells," end quote. This is talking about how mages go into the Umbra in the Renaissance time, and they see the heavens and they see the hells, and so they just totally believe in it because that's what they see. This was an interesting passage because it interprets the Renaissance Umbra for storytellers. It states what mages of that era are going to see, and they're going to see Christian notions. However, I don't think it's right for the author to interpret the Umbra for all of the storytellers out there. Storytellers should handle the Umbra the way they want. Plus, it ignores the elemental courts and other material from the core book. So that was, stood out as a very odd passage to me. There are 3 pages of motivations for becoming an infernalist. After chapter 1, I didn't think this was all that helpful, really, but there's 10 pages on the 4 stages of the infernalist path. This is useful for infernalist player characters, but for NPCs, this is just more than I need. Page 38, the info about an infernalist's daemon, or avatar in this case, assumes the infernalist is a Witterslansha or has gone through the calls. And so I think that section on the daemons of infernalists actually needed to be rewritten for non-Nephandi infernalists. So if I was an editor, I would have raised a point about that. Terry talked about some of the shortcomings of the Infernalist templates. As I was reading through it, I actually really liked this section. The illustrations were nice, of course, but that's not why I liked it. It gave me a good set of ideas for how I could have Infernalist NPCs that are not the typical Infernalist NPC, which... Yeah, I know Infernalists all don't dress the same and look the same and follow the same practice, but still, when you're a storyteller and you're prepping for a game and you want to have an Infernalist in it, but the story isn't all about the Infernalist, there's sort of that instant go-to notion. And this says, hey, look, why don't you widen your view here? You could use Infernalist in all these different ways. Here's some quick templates to get you started. And I appreciate that. I think as a storyteller, it would get me started. There's a note on page 49 about how many blood pagans have infiltrated the verbena. I thought that was interesting. Tells in so many places in Mage we hear about how the verbena have their act together and they're really a good sort and they don't like you talking about how they have problems. And here it's like, they got problems, by the way. It's like, oh, yeah, I guess I could see this. That's interesting. There was one template, Old Nick's Gunman, talking about how this is an Infernalist who works cannons and he's evil. And it's like, okay, so? I mean, I never really thought of people who operate cannons as inherently Infernalist, but do we have carpenters and manservants and maidservants who are evil? It's like you could take any profession and just say, yeah, they're evil. So yeah, Old Nick's Gunman just stuck out as odd. It's like if you just knock it out, I think it would help. There was one I really liked, Twilight Mystic. This is someone who doesn't serve a particular evil being, but understands the notion of the void and how it's hiding behind everything we see and know. And I was like, okay, this is really interesting. This is something different. And it says, oh, by the way, they aren't an Infernalist at all. They're a Marauder. It's like, well, then why are they in this book that's focusing on Infernalists and not on Marauders? It's like, you really got me. And then you said, nah, they're not an Infernalist. We just put them in because, anyways, let's move on to the next one. How do I react? It's like, it's a cool idea, but it's not supposed to be here. It's like, okay, well, I'll think that one over. To round out at the end of the chapter, we get the Centipede King, who, yeah, he is all about centipedes, but still, reading that description, that was a cool NPC villain. I would like to use that guy. He's basically in the Far East, so more, I guess, Chinese or Mongolian perhaps than European, but still, I mean, mages can get around. They have some sphere magic. They can pop up next door and put centipedes in your backyard. So I really like that NPC. That was very cool. So I guess I'm ready for Chapter 3.
Chapter 3 is entitled Ars Maleficarum. This goes through magic. Talks about the Supplicii. These are the dark seekings that are led by the Avatar rather than being merely escorted by them. This gives an optional rule where another character may be forced into one. If they botch a willpower roll, they have to go through it, which to me is just kind of like ridiculous. This is part of the school of storytelling where it's like, well, that roll came out in a weird direction. Better completely reconsider all my plot plans for the next 3 sessions. The pact rankings are much more metal than they are in the modern world, where we get pacts versus the power that they give you. And in Book of the Fallen, like, murder is listed at level like 5. Here it's like number 2 out of the gate. Yeah, there's level 1 where you kick over someone's sandcastle, but at level 2 you're immediately flaying people and sacrificing them to your dark god. And you're like, oh buddy. Where like it makes me feel that there was some sort of like grade inflation where nowadays Satan demands less of you, where it's like, do you want me to kill people? They're like, I guess you could. That seems a little excessive. How about we start with just like messing with somebody's birthday cake or writing something funny on somebody's windshield when it's really cold out. So like Satan kind of loses his groove apparently in M20 comparison. We get the ideas and information about dark thaumaturgy, which cannot be used with spheres, but we get an indication that demonic investments are for storyteller characters only. Then why did you give us point values for them and tell us how much they cost and tell us the system for how to get them? It's like so the storyteller can have their own little secret game with just Nefandi that they do with everything else. It's like finding out someone is in 2 softball leagues where you're like, wait, you're playing with somebody else? I thought it was just us. It's like, wait, you have another set of characters that you're running through the dark torments of the dark fantastic? It would make my storyteller feel like they were cheating on me. They give us kind of a dark version of True Faith, except for the part where it's not entirely True Faith, and every level of it comes tied with a variant of the Echoes flaw. I don't know how I feel about the idea that certain focuses reduce the difficulty against the Infernalist, and then we get flaws Sure. We get the maleficia, the poisoned magic, the spheres themselves. We get their idea that their 10th sphere is the absolute, which doesn't do anything. We get mentions to the clip oath. They don't, again, do anything here, and we don't get information really about how they work or why anyone would go to them. We get some additional foci, sure. We get routes, where, for instance, in addition to regular fire, you can summon balefire, which adds spirit 3, which makes it slower to heal, because few things are more engaging and gripping in a game than calculating out realistic healing times for effects. Soul Cloak can hide your resonance, which is kind of cool. Witch Wind allows you to create a storm so destructive that people struck by it turn into assholes. Then we get a bunch of sects, and when I think sects, I think factions, and when I think factions, I think Adam. Would you like to talk about the sects, Adam?
Yes, the sects, which is not like another word that
Talk
sounds
about
a lot
the sects,
like that.
Adam.
The Bahari are devotees of Lilith and believe mystic enlightenment comes from experiencing and inflicting pain. They tend lush, frightening gardens that would make Clark Ashton Smith proud. If you don't know what I mean, then read the short story, The Garden of Adompha. We will supply a link for you. It is online legally. Bahari congregate in groups of 3 to 7 members. They have a surprising amount of influence in both sleeper and mage society. They practice a variety of styles from Babylonian to Greek to Celtic magic. They are involved with elemental spirits more than classical devils. There is the Qual, and I may be mispronouncing that. Listeners, let us know. This group is also called Howlers of the Waste. They're more of a type of infernalist than an organized cult, but they do sometimes form groups that hide beneath cities or mountains. They are dangerously insane and hurt themselves, each other, and anyone they come across when they are active at night. They are an early iteration of the Kal-Shah, which is a Nefandi group that appears in every edition of Mage. Although rarely sane enough to speak coherently, they form empathic bonds with each other, enabling them to work together. They bow to worm spirits, devils, or just the void itself. They have powerful arts, and other mages wonder if there's any way to learn from them without going mad. Decadenti are bored, jaded Italian city dwellers who gather for infernalist rites and rarely understand the full extent of what they're getting into. Although this group has many wealthy and educated members, few attain much mystical power. This is not one group, but a category of brotherhoods and lodges, which follow different magical practices from classical to anti-Christian, Far Eastern, and others. Decadenti work hard to keep their gatherings secret and sometimes divert witch hunters from their own groups to innocent mages. The gatekeepers of Ganzir are in Persia and practice to the best of their ability the dark magics employed by witch priests of ancient Mesopotamian kingdoms. They maintain old pacts with demons and remember ancient astrology. They retain the secrets of the Arabian Devil King age. They are allies with the Nefandi and are spreading to Europe, especially the Italian peninsula. These celestial masters of the Order of Reason are keen to learn the secrets of the stars but don't realize the knowledge is being passed to them by infernalists. The Nefandi who terrorized the ancient Mesopotamian cities are still around. In Renaissance times, the Nefandi are fewer and weaker than they were long ago, but they have the calls and a special insight on the void that allows them to avoid idolizing demons as so many other infernalists do. This description states they may have created the calls rather than discovered them. We learn here that the Nefandi learned subtlety from their long war with the Ali Batin. Nefandi are not one organized group, but their methods and insights cause them to operate much like one. They have embarked on a project to infiltrate and dominate other infernalist groups that will eventually lead to the fallen ones known in Mage the Ascension, and the Jody Blake write-up did refer to that. So those are the sects we get for this book. I was kind of hoping to get a few more, but there are certainly some interesting plot hooks in here.
Yeah, we get a bunch that don't really have detail. The Hual, I like that this is the one group that you and I agree on how it's pronounced. I don't think there are two Hermetic houses that you and I say the same way, but the Hual, we kind of had the same wobble to it. I'm not sure how I feel about all of Babylonian magic being bound to demons. It's kind of like one of those things where it's like, these primitive people couldn't have built the pyramids. It must have been done by aliens, where it's like, can we give literally anyone credit for anything before the year 500 or something like that? It portrays the fallen as worshiping the absolute and considering everything else, like what we have, is kind of a pale imitation of that. They wish to become the absolute. Okay, what does that give us? We don't quite get that. And if you want to say how dark and seductive the path of power is. Give me a bunch of powers that they get that are dark and seductive, and we get literally one system for it where it's like, yep, you can do demonic pacts that can be taken back at any time, are intermittently used, and you're not available to you as a player because we said this is specifically for storytellers, but we're going to give it enough detail that players can do it. Okay. What did you think about Chapter 3 on the whole?
Well, the Supplicii, or the Dark Seeking section, I thought it was only useful for player characters. I mean, if you have the assumption that we're going to have Infernalist player characters, then okay, I can see this section. Otherwise, I don't really need it. A whole page recommending against but equipping Infernalist player characters. We don't want you to do this, which is why we're telling you exactly how to do this, I guess. Investments are, actually, I found them creative and interesting. When used well, I think they can confuse your players during game sessions, and that's why I appreciate them. This villain is doing this. Oh, he must be using these spheres. I'm going to counter those. Wait, it's not working. What's happening? What is this guy doing? It's like, yeah, you can get some interesting play out of that, but just make sure that your player characters are facing off against other sorcerers first before they hit the Infernalists who are using investments. That way you get much more effect out of it. Merits and flaws, I found them interesting. For NPCs, I don't really consider point values, but I'm not going to complain about that because I know that I've talked to a lot of mage storytellers who build their NPCs strictly adhering to the character creation process so that the finished NPC is on a par with a finished player character. So, yeah, that's understandable. I thought there were merits, or I can't remember if they're merits or flaws, but there's demonic heritage and unholy aura. And those two I thought were very interesting. Demonic heritage is from birth. You have something in your genes that adds mystical abilities to you, and there's benefits and drawbacks, both rather potent. And so I thought those could be interesting to portray in an NPC. Also, the unholy aura, which I'm pretty sure was a flaw, was basically this guy has so much evil influence working in him that it's actually like, in a sense, physically leaking out of his body. He's got so many signs, so many weaknesses because his nature inside him has changed so much. And so I thought also that would be kind of fun to show in an NPC as a storyteller. Us storytellers have to have some fun too, you know.
Yeah.
Page 82, quote, "The deepest secret of Qlipothic magic, however, is this," end quote. This passage works well. It explains how Infernalists believe they have gained deep mystic insight, when actually they've only seen an incomplete picture. Destruction is the destiny of the physical world. They go to places in the Umbra where they see, a great vortex of destruction, and they're told, this is the fate of the whole Umbra. All of the Umbra is leading to this, but they are not taken to the places in the Umbra where there's a great, strong maintenance of the current order, or there isn't a big creatrix, churning out tons and tons of new energy and new created things. And so, like I said, it's an incomplete picture. They show initiates the dark evil stuff and say, look, it's all leading to this. Like, well, I guess so. I've seen it myself. The idea that really comes up for me is the Umbra the complete set of the possible spiritual realms in your chronicle? If so, then that's going to affect things. As the Wraith the Oblivion Cosmos suggests, there is indication that there are spirit realms beyond the three layers of the Umbra and very hard to get to, but still possible. And if that's true, then the destruction you see happening in the Umbra is about the Umbra and the physical world. There are realms beyond. And so, again, the incomplete picture. You take a bunch of new recruits and you say, look, it's all breaking down. Accept it. That's the way it is. And they don't get to see the rest of the story. So as a storyteller constructing plots, thinking out how a discussion with an important NPC as the climax of a story is going to go, that's when I reach for these kinds of ideas, and they help me plan something interesting for my players. We get I'm going to mispronounce this, Aesfotedia. This is basically dark TAS, and the book tells us that this is not a new kind of TAS, it's just TAS, but it has such a strong negative resonance that many mages on both sides of the divide, the tradition mages and also the Infernalists think that this is an inherently different kind of task and operates by completely different rules. So I thought that was interesting. It would be fun to run a longer chronicle and then towards the end let your players catch on. Oh, we were just told this, but now we know the real story. There are many mentions in this book of the really evil things that Infernalists do when they have their gatherings, their dark masses, etc. And then we have lines like, quote, demons often attend and join the fun. I believe, I understand a little sarcasm is par for the course, but the things that Infernalists do are repeatedly referred to as fun in this book, and the sarcasm got a little thick for me at times. I noticed it in this chapter. Diabolical instruments, basically the instruments in Mage 20, foci in the older editions of Mage. This is what the Infernalists use. Useful, it should be here, but more detail than I needed. It described dark acts that evil people do, and it's like, for some of this, it's like, yeah, I get the picture. You don't need to give me that much detail. Let's not have too much here. Also, just little interesting thing for me was on page 84. It talks about how human sacrifice is done, but, quote, a human being has very little quintessence to offer, end quote. And it's like, yeah, that's reinforcing the idea from older editions of Mage that there is a reason why mages are not killing sleepers left and right for quintessence, because there's not much there. But then we look at Mage 20, it's like, well, there's a significant amount of quintessence there. It's like, okay, this is actually going to affect how NPCs and player characters are going to plan their day. So that stands out to me. There's a rote for balefire. I thought that was really cool. It's a kind of flame, but it's like flames from the lower umbra. They're a different color. They're intensely cold instead of hot. I've seen this in fantasy role-playing games before, and I think it's just a cool idea. Something to play with, something that might confuse your player characters because, of course, they don't know how to use this stuff, and there's a reason for that. Balefire is not something you want to get too close to. Soul Cloak was a way that Infernalists hide their aura from other mages, trying to see, is this one a bad egg or not? I thought it was too hard. It requires so many spheres that it seems like there's not a whole lot of Infernalists who are going to use Soul Cloak to hide their auras. So that's something to think about. We get 13 grimoires. I guess they were interesting. None of them, the only one that really stood out to me was a class or a grouping of grimoires called Liber Spiritums. I thought that was a cool name. It's basically describing how mages who learn things about the Umbra and Umbrid and the Spirit Sphere, they keep their own journal. And it's useful to other mages who come across it later because the Umbra is so huge and there's so much to know about these things that every journal you pick up is really going to help. So I liked that one. There is a sort of Infernalist device, the Iron Satan, which they have an illustration of a metallic centipede that crawls out unexpectedly. It's very dangerous to whoever it runs across, and it leaves an infernal taint afterwards. I thought it was a cool write-up. I would like to use this as a storyteller. And the Gatekeepers of Ganzir, one of the sects, that particular write-up out of the 5 was packed with cool ideas. I like how they have this ancient knowledge about astronomy/astrology, and they're passing it to the Order of Reason secretly, and they're causing problems that could lead to the metaplot of the modern era, depending on how you want to use the material on the Void Engineers. But and not just that, it talks about secrets that this group of Infernalists has that others don't, and so you could have, like the Dead Magic books suggested in Revised Edition, that there's secrets that mages really want to know, and they're going to go looking for it even if they're going to take a great risk to get it. So loved that. But okay, well, I've been talking long enough. What's in Chapter 4?
Chapter 4, The Devil Sends the Beast. This is interesting because the devil is often referred to as the beast, so it's like the devil sends himself. This section draws on werewolf cosmology, and we get our first talk about the weaver, the worm, and the wild, and so on, and that made Terry a sad panda. The drawings in this section immediately become not good. They're just kind of scanned pencil sketches that don't appear to have been finished. We get a random note that all demons take double damage to true faith and can die just from being touched. But we get a whole bunch of creatures and their weaknesses and kind of vague powers they can have. The Dust Men section make reference to the Bokor, which kind of suggests that Sorcerer's Crusade will include transatlantic chronicles or time travel, in that this is tied to voodoo, which didn't really exist yet. And I don't know that, like, the Igbo faith that kind of progenerated, that was like informed voodoo, had that title in it. But again, I'm not a history person, but that just didn't seem to make sense. We get a number of, for lack of a better term, baddies that your characters can fight, like the living skeleton or the fomor or the devilfish, or a demon hound that you can just kind of fight. They're very obviously kind of just set up as bad guys. There's not much like social depth to them, although there are somewhat detailed write-ups. We get the idea that hobgoblins, the little satans that bother people on their fast to descent, are there to just make your life hard, unless you're really evil and clever and realize, wait, they're me and I'm evil, so I can make them evil. And you're like, oh, okay. Once again, the true evil is the power of friendship. We get a bunch of greater demons that are not quite greater demons. A lot of these characters are ridiculously powerful. We get Dorian the Demon Lover and Leela Tomas, Eater of Tongues. We get at least 4 characters that have a power of 60. Power essentially turns into health levels unless they're materializing, then they have separate health levels, except in this book where the number of materialized health levels are not listed. So if that's the case, like, sure, they're listed as a tempter and they have 17 dice to try and seduce you, but if you do try and get the upper hand against them, congratulations, you're up against a meat wall, and that's going to take a month and a half to destroy, because this is an era before bullets, so you can't even describe them as being a bullet sponge. Leela has a power of 100, and her seduction dice pool is 16 with a willpower of 8. And then we get the greater entities, where they're like, oh yeah, these are beyond statistics. This felt like there was a presumption that these creatures were going to have implied weaknesses, or that the characters were going to bring holy might around them. But if a character has a power of 100, and even with the power of true faith, they do double damage, they're now down to having a mere 50 health levels, which makes these demons vastly harder to kill than I imagine, like the wall of a castle. We'll see, because Castles and Covenants is up next. All the bits of it didn't quite point in the same direction to me in a way that I kind of found bothersome. We don't get a lot of information on why the grand demonic manifestations are really that hard to summon, except for the fact that it's like, the Gauntlet and God's will have banished them to the Netherworld, but they really want to come back, so maybe hell isn't so appealing after all. I'm like, yeah, I like my house. I like going on vacation every once in a while still. But this section felt like the wheels started to come off. We get long descriptions in certain areas that don't really seem that necessary. But yeah, so this is a chapter. If you wanted to have obscenely powerful character things for your characters to come up against, they were here. I would strongly recommend you kind of modify the power level to taste and so on. It gives you a basic demonic toolbox of what could be the nature of baddies, but on the whole, this kind of left me kind of with a mediocre taste in my mouth. What did you think, Adam?
On page 102, there's a section, Splinters of Oblivion. This mentions those who believe in demons and more educated mages who say demons are spirits shaped by human belief. It goes on to say there are things older than humanity who either don't bother with recognizable forms or wear them occasionally. The truth in your games can be as complicated or nuanced as you like. I actually kind of appreciated that part. It takes, I think, a discussion that is sometimes oversimplified between mage fans and adds a little nuance to it, which makes it fun for me. The powers of all demons are given on page 103, and this was... I had to chuckle at this because there was a book for Dungeons & Dragons put out in, I believe, the 80s or early 80s, Deities and Demigods, and it has been causing ripples throughout the RPG atmosphere for a very, very long time. Deities and Demigods said, hey, you can add deities and demigods to your D&D games, isn't that fun? And then they give stats for them, and it's basically encouraged mid to more high-level characters to challenge them to fights and beat them up, and then D&D fans were bragging to each other about all the gods they'd killed, and even the people who wrote that book have gone on the internet in later years and said, yeah, we screwed up. That was not what we were trying to put out there. And so I saw a reaction against that book here again in yet another RPG book. They're saying, here are the powers that all demons have. They're very, very powerful. You can't kill them. No, really, we're telling you, you can't kill them. You might find one really weak one you can beat in a fight, but he'll just, he'll lose his physical form and he'll recoalesce somewhere else, and he'll come back later and he'll be really mad and bring all his friends, and you'll be so sorry you did it. It's like, okay, look, I get the point. Okay, we get the point. Yes, not all demons are supposed to be brawling opponents. okay, but I think you kind of overstated it here. But yes, all demons are so powerful that apparently they want player characters to just be afraid of them. And I think as a storyteller, I like them to be wary of them. I don't want them to be terrified of them. So I might tone down some of these and, I'll let them win some fights, but I don't want them jumping into the brawling ring with every demon they find. That would be dumb. Now, on page 109, it basically gives us game stats for hobgoblins. And when I say hobgoblins, that's the game term from every edition of Mage. When a mage goes into quiet, beings or objects will take on physical form and actually be there in front of everyone, and they're called hobgoblins. And we get the impression, especially from earlier editions of Mage, that these take the shape of actual like beings, like little imps or goblins or something like that will cause problems for the mage and possibly others as well. And those were never given stats in the 4 editions of Mage because it depends on the circumstances. How powerful is the mage? What does the hobgoblin look like? Where does it manifest? All these different things. And so storytellers are told, hey, look, give me your own stats and run with the ball. Here it says, these are the stats for hobgoblins. And I was like reading this, I was like, okay, sorry, no, I don't appreciate that. I think it's interesting to mention how hobgoblins would appear with like a demonic physical appearance, and that would cause mages in the world of the Renaissance to look at that and say, oh, look, here's proof that all of our beliefs about demons are real. You can take that to some interesting places in your games. But just to put down the stats and say, here's your stats, I would say, no, storytellers do your own stats depending on the circumstances. Towards the end, we get basically the list of devils. And I guess for some people, they would look at that and say, oh, this is lame. I could find something better on the internet. Possibly, but for me, I have not been reading books about lists of demons, and when I go on the internet, I don't research devils. And so this list was actually really interesting for me. I get devils from different cultures, different religions. It doesn't try to give me stats for everything. It just gives me some descriptions. I thought it was actually a good decision on the author's part to take beings that are seen as deities of some religions and put them on the list and say, look, there are some people who, by Renaissance times, interpret them as being representatives of their grievances and their anger against society or Christianity, or even as representative of evil forces, which, a few hundred years before they were not seen that way. But hey, this is the 1500s, and some people actually do see them that way. Yes, it would be nice to take a time machine and go back in time and say, hey, you got that wrong. But I mean, at the time, they thought that. And so they go on to this list. And so I think the author took a risk, and I think that was the right kind of risk to take for covering this kind of material. So I actually liked the Devil's List. Give me a nice compact list so I don't have to go researching the internet, and then my wife walks in. What are you looking at? A page on demonology? What are you getting into? It's like, I did not need this episode. So thank you, book. But there was an appendix. Terry, what did you think about that one?
The appendix is the aforementioned list of just kind of demons that we get, and I very much enjoyed this. It's entitled Infernal Roll Call. And one of the things it brings up in a couple places is the idea that there are ancient gods that the Nefandi are worshipping. And this brings up a couple interesting options. That the idea that the Christianization of the West has made everything seem like it is demonic. So someone could worship Isis or Thoth, and they're like, we worship demons. You're like, that's the God of wisdom, truth, and enlightenment. Yes, but it's not Jesus. He said he brings peace and love and understanding. It's like, yes, but it's a different kind, and it's weird, making me evil. And you're like, what is happening here? The other thing that I thought was interesting was it made mention in a few places, like the Anubis entry, that it is worshipped in perverse form by the Nefandi. And my initial thought was that these gods are like, oh, these asshats worshiping me. No, that's not my name. I don't look like that. Can you stop? Or alternatively, there's a thing where these gods, their worship has stopped, except by this group. And in kind of this dark inversion of the normal worship process, they start changing what the god is. And they use worship as a weaponized form of corruption to kind of feed back up the great chain of being, which I thought was kind of interesting. Again, man, they hate on the Babylonians in here. I don't know why. I'm generally pro Babylon, so which is a weird thing to say out loud, but I'm on the record for it. also has this through line throughout the book where it's like, Zoroastrianism, man, it's some cool stuff. Like someone had recently discovered it and they just find a way to weave it into every conversation. And you're like, yeah, okay, I understand this kind of represented this idea of duality that you kind of find fascinating, but I really don't think you're understanding who Ahriman is. So this plus Bygone Bestiary, which Adam and I recently talked about, it kind of has that as a recurring theme, which I like just because it's an Aryan idea that characters from Western Europe could not unlikely run into if a storyteller wanted them to. It's a useful list. I wish it had a little bit more on actually like Christian demons and devils and so on. And we don't really get any information on Goetia, which to me felt like it should have been in here, but also again the drawings in this section are just kind of pencil drawings. We then get a bunch of original demons, the primal manifestations. I thought these were great. Hrug, the shadow of all that dies. Ba'ashkael, the claws of the night. Thanks. I can run with this. I do wish it had a little bit more on, hey, here's a cool thing they could do, or why a character would contact them, or a weird thing their followers can do. But again, I think Satyros has a superpower when it comes to coming up with concise lists of interesting ideas, and I think the writing would be improved by that. It is something they seemingly do well, and it's good to see them do that here. We then get inspirational sources, which is long. Yeah. And that's my thought on that. What did you think about the appendix, Adam?
Yeah, I should apologize to the listeners. Some of my notes on the appendix I mixed into Chapter 4. My mistake. But no, the evil spirits at the end of Chapter 4 I thought were quite interesting. But getting back to the appendix, I thought the primal manifestations were great. They're purely fictional figures. And Terry and I have said in the past how they become a lot more versatile for those, especially who are running online games. But I thought that was interesting. Especially don't miss Angu of the Howling Entrails. Great at parties. And that wraps it up. I guess general thoughts on the book, Jerry?
General thoughts on the book. I kind of bristle at the idea that the path to infernalism is pretty consistent with similar steps. It's kind of one of those things like the hero's journey, like everyone goes through it, do they? And I feel like that conflicts with kind of the rest of the information that we get. I don't know how I feel about how even in the 15th century, the idea that infernalism could theoretically be around any corner. Part of what makes the Dark Fantastic interesting to me is it doesn't have that veneer of everything is shit that the modern World of Darkness sometimes can have. With the possible exception of investments, there's no benefit to becoming like a Nefandus, and the cost is pretty huge. Give me some mechanical benefits to selling my soul. Make them clear, make them obvious. If someone is doing this for power and prestige and everything, give me the systems that show that. The book includes the worm. These are just kind of hallmarks of a certain style of writing that we get. It makes me, in retrospect, less interested in Book of the Fallen because this book is shorter and contains most of the same, like, precursor ideas. I feel like the more time I spend with Infernalism, the more confusing it is as a philosophical viewpoint. To what extent do they actually want to embrace nothing? Is it a metaphor for power? There isn't an aligned worldview that makes sense to me for everything. It has this tone of, you think you know darkness, well, I know darkness, which also occurred in Destiny's Price, which to me is just kind of demeaning to the reader. It kind of treats the Nefandi as primus inter partes, that they are kind of the first among equals for Nephandic sects. Like one of the ideas within Sorcerer's Crusade is that faith, power, and reason are kind of at war with each other and who's going to win. I would have loved an infernalist war that kind of mirrored that had infernalistic societies that just don't quite make it and don't get merged into anything. It blurred the lines between the Verbena and the infernalists in a lot of cases, which I thought was kind of interesting. I would have liked a little bit more blurring for everyone else. And it also felt weird that we got no mention of people that you would think are infernalists but aren't for some reason. Like Vormos, Grand Harvester of Souls, is a master by the 15th century. I would have, mostly this is me saying, why didn't you refer to Vormos, one of my favorite characters? It's like, why didn't you bring Ensign Ricky back? I love Ensign Ricky. So that's just me kind of like fanboying over Vormos, Grand Harvester of Souls, which is a weird sentence to say out loud. The editing started getting loose. This is a sole author book, so the consistency of voice is useful, but anything you find annoying about that voice, there's really nothing to bring it in. I thought the art up until the last chapter was pretty evocative, where it just kind of transitions to pencil drawings and so on. We have a different symbol seemingly for the Nefandi, which is evocative and I appreciated. This is a book I didn't really feel was too necessary for the game. It was interesting and it was a type of useful, but I feel as if it had contradictory missions inside of it. But on the whole, there's a bunch of useful stuff in here, a bunch of things that are interesting. There are some interesting systems for creating demons and other creatures. I think it is a little bit internally confused, but otherwise it's got some pretty good chunks and pretty great sections in it. What did you think, Adam?
Well, the artwork from Chapter 4 and the appendix, I think that was, in my opinion, it was more of a victim of the technology, the publishing technologies of the time.
Okay.
I think the artist turned them in, and his actual art, hand illustrations on the page, people looked at them and said, wow, this looks really, really nice. But then when, reproduced and published and printed, it just didn't look the same. It did not look as good. And actually, I think my criticism would be not so much at the artist as at the art director who said, yeah, let's run with this, instead of, hey, this would be great for another project. So I think if you were to see if I were to look at the originals of these art pieces, I think they would be pretty good in my opinion. They have a grayscale background for sidebars in this book that is so light that it's really hard to tell if a sidebar is a sidebar. And again, that might have just been the publishing technologies at the time. It was 98. We keep thinking, oh, it's not that far back. Didn't they have what we have now? Well, actually, no, they didn't. So it's unfortunate. It seems like as I was reading through the book, I had to repeatedly stop and examine the page carefully, get my eyes close. It's like, okay, this is in fact a sidebar. This is a break in the the flowing of the text. So I need to think of this differently. For me, it was surprising to see how much revised edition material I saw before revised edition started. For example, Dead Magick had a chapter on the evil Nefandi of long ago in the Mesopotamian cities, and they lifted that out of here. There's 2 parts in the book where they get into detail, and of course they expanded on it. That's nice, of course, but it was just surprising to see how much they got from Sorcerer's Crusade. Also, the Book of Madness Revised took a lot of its material on the Nefandi right out of this book. And so interesting to see how much a revised edition paid attention to Sorcerer's Crusade. Also, I saw the initial rough draft of Book of the Fallen in here, as Terry had mentioned. So yeah, that does really stand out. One thing that kept throwing me for a loop was non-mages, those who are unawakened, are repeatedly called mortals throughout the book. It's like, well, mages after they awaken, they're still mortal. I mean, they die the same way that mortals do, and most of them never learn the magic to extend their lives. So mages are mortals. It just threw me. I had to keep reminding myself, okay, this is like a special term in this book. And of course, this book is not intended to be a player's guide. Nevertheless, some people will insist it is one, end quote. It's like, well, isn't it? I mean, sure looks like one to me.
Yeah, there's a section like how to play a Nefandus. You're like,
Yeah, so it's like, that's an interesting statement to see here, but all right. The Nefandi are a recognizable and interesting faction in Mage, and so it's reasonable to expect that when most Mage fans pick up this book, it's like, I want to see some stuff on Nefandi. As a person who had just finished reading the other Sorcerer's Crusade books, I came into this book expecting to hear mention of them, but them to be like a little group off on the side. But no, they are a big active group. And what was interesting about that was it really shows how the calls that the Nefandi either invented or discovered are a major tool for them. It really gives them a cohesion as a group. It gives them a tool to use in working against other infernalist groups. I mean, it basically says in the book, in nicer terms that I'm using, but the Nefandi will either talk people into entering the calls or push them in, and after that, they're either one of theirs or they're dead. So back when we were talking about the Book of the Fallen, I was saying there's different key ideas to focus on. What is the definition of a Nefand? Is it a mage who's really evil? Is it a mage who serves dark powers? Is it a mage who's gone through the calls? And reading this book, I see there was there's something behind the argument that they are mages who have gone through the calls, and there is an effect on them, and it affects how their group holds together and works with other groups. So it was interesting to see that here in this book. This book mentions an idea seen previously in mage books, that the truth is so frightening or so difficult that to know it is to go insane. Infernalists who truly grasp the void become broken messes. Marauders who truly grasp the truth of paradox or the nature of reality lose their minds. This suggests humans aren't capable of understanding the real truth. What does this mean for mages? Ascension is a false hope? Seeking the truth should be abandoned for your own good? Turning one's back on finding the truth would be too frustrating for mages who have already learned so much about the world they live in. Giving it up doesn't seem like a viable option. Do you find a higher being who can give you a simplified version appropriate for humans? Religions suddenly don't seem so ridiculous. Maybe that's why there are so many religious mages. Or do you convert yourself into one of those higher beings so you can then grasp that dangerous truth without hurting yourself? Is that what ascension really is? Is that why some mages pursue godhood? I appreciate the fact that this book brought up this point and got me into this frame of mind. So that was one of my takeaways from reading the book. And I guess that wraps up my thoughts on that. Basically, like Terry said, I liked a lot of the material here for Infernalist NPCs, but it was a lot more than I needed. It should have been either a shorter, like an 80-page book, or put them together with Marauders. It could be half of a Infernalist / Marauder book. I thought that I would put my money down for that back in the 90s or now. But that wraps up my thoughts on that. So Terry, was there a quote among all of this florid material that was worthy of being mentioned at the end of this episode?
There was a bunch of pithy writing throughout, but one that quickly leaped out to me was the one in the introduction where the character is talking about the terrible things they did and how they won't share it. And they said, "I, you see, am far too proud of my depredations to share credit with the innocent. Pride may be a sin, but it is most delicious on one's tongue." And I just thought
that is memorable, certainly.
So what are we reading next, Adam?
Castles and Covenants, which I have never had the chance to read, but just flipping through it, I'm excited about it because it looks like Book of Chantries 2. Maybe it isn't, but it's got me thinking that, and that's exciting.
Yeah.
But if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you liked the show you heard today, then leave us a review. Your reviews of Mage the Podcast make us more visible in other people's searches. We'd certainly appreciate that. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast.
I would be glad to. I would like to especially thank our Oracle backers, Oracle Buck Gregory, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Josh Hillerup, Oracle Jay Widener, Oracle McHale, and Oracle the Crew of Erebus. Additionally, I'd like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anand, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Boo, Boogers to the Six, Brad the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cubbin, Daniel Scrimder, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Derek Semsick, Dennis Osborne, Fragger Rock, Gargle Lenoir, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Skinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nabarro, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klemenov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Schonheimer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Thank you for your support.
If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth and tell paradox, baby.
Go change reality in a kind of complicated form of Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian mythology, but also a little bit of Gnosticism if you want to keep things spicy. Bye.